It was in the spring of that year. Leo and Cassie were busking downtown, dancing on a flattened cardboard box, when a producer from a local TV station happened to walk by. He saw something in them and brought them in for an audition. Neither had any formal training, but Leo was an eager student, and Cassie radiated a defiant confidence. At first, they were just fill-ins for the studio's dance troupe, hired on a day-rate basis whenever someone called out sick. When they weren't working, Leo and Cassie would be back on the street, dancing, dropping everything to sprint to the studio when a call came through. The station had a sprawling cafeteria, and a meal was included with the job. The two of them would blend into the crowd, heads down, devouring the free food. During that time, Leo shot up another inch, but he was stuck wearing the same high-water pants and jacket that was too short in the sleeves. After a dance gig, Leo would tag along with the other dancers. The whole group would pile into a grimy little internet cafe nearby. Leo didn't even know how to turn on a computer. He and Cassie would huddle over a single monitor, playing Minesweeper. Leo can still recall the oppressively low ceiling of that place, the air thick and hazy with stale cigarette smoke. The lighting was dim, casting long shadows. He clumsily clicked the mouse and a mine exploded on the screen. Eventually, the other dancers showed them an instant messaging program. They had to coordinate what time they'd be online just to meet in a chat room. Using 2 index fingers, Leo painstakingly typed out a hello to Cassie. She would tap back a hello to you too. Whenever Leo emerged from the internet cafe, the world felt vast and open again. The streets bustled with people coming and going. He'd stop by a corner store to buy a cup of instant mac and cheese, then walk back to his room in the boarding house to cook it in the shared, grimy kitchen. Cradling his metal bowl, he'd sit on the edge of his bed, slurping the noodles as the sun dipped below the horizon, marking the end of another day. Later, he secured a more regular spot at the station. There were countless moves to new, cheap apartments. On payday, he would treat himself to a single Hostess cupcake in its crinkly plastic wrapper. He went with the older dancers to see a play downtown, his heart pounding as he walked into a department store to buy new clothes for the first time. He tried on a long-sleeved shirt and stepped out of the dressing room, feeling self-conscious. The girls who had come with him all said it looked good. He touched the price tag, hesitating for a long moment before finally deciding to buy it. Once he saved up a little money, he followed a colleague's advice and enrolled in night classes at the local community college. The classes were 3 times a week, and he never missed one. In the fresh notebook they gave him, he wrote his name, Leo, in careful block letters. Staring at the 4 letters, he suddenly realized how long it had been since he thought of the person who taught him how to write his name. It felt like that morning on the Greyhound bus, leaving the small town by the new community college campus. He had pressed his face against the window, watching the figure standing at the bus station. Leo had raised a hand to wave. The person on the platform had smiled back. The bus, like a warm loaf of bread, pulled out of the station into the misty dawn. Leo kept looking back, watching until the person shrank to the size of a period, a final punctuation mark on that early morning. If Cassie hadn't brought up the name again on the city bus, Leo thought he might have almost forgotten him. He spent the rest of the ride in a daze, realizing that the memory of being thrown out of the Crestview apartment that night no longer stung. He truly had been that gullible, that easy to fool. It made perfect sense that he would be abandoned. The night he went to register for classes, Leo clutched the course list, his knuckles white. He nervously asked the admissions counselor how many of these classes he would have to take to get a little smarter. The counselor, not quite hearing him, looked up and asked what he wanted to get. Leo repeated that he just wanted to be a little smarter. In the sweltering summer of 1999, Leo finished his first semester of night classes with excellent grades. He carried the report card around, showing it to everyone. Cassie joked that she would buy him a frame for it. Leo planned to continue his studies, adding English and computer classes next. Around that time, Cassie became good friends with another dancer, Jenna. Jenna's parents were working in a city somewhere in Europe, and she was making arrangements to join them. Cassie wanted to go with her. Leo had no idea where Europe even was. Cassie dragged him to the department store and pointed it out on a large world map tacked to a wall, her finger tracing across oceans and continents. She asked if he wanted to come along, reasoning that there wasn't much for them here anyway, so they might as well see the world. A profound emptiness bloomed in Leo's chest. Starting in August, Cassie and Jenna began the process of getting their papers in order. She took the bus back to her hometown several times to gather documents. When she unlocked the door to her old one-room apartment in the housing projects, the sharp scent of medicated oil was completely gone. A few of her grandmother's old shirts were still folded at the foot of the bottom bunk. Cassie had always thought of her life as a tragedy. She'd never known her parents, and her grandmother had barely managed to raise her. Even after her ex-boyfriend, Mark, had cheated on her, she'd stayed, desperate for any kind of affection. But looking at her grandmother's threadbare clothes, worn for who knows how many years, Cassie suddenly understood that her grandmother had probably done the best she could. Maybe that was the absolute limit of her ability. After finding her documents, Cassie sat on her grandmother's bunk and cried quietly for a while. After about 2 days, Cassie returned to the city. She climbed the flights of stairs to the top floor of their tenement building and knocked on Leo's door, handing him a bag of Sour Patch Kids she'd bought at a gas station along the way. The sugar coating had melted into a sticky syrup from the long journey, but Leo accepted it with genuine delight. Cassie sat on his bed, swinging her legs, and mentioned that Mark was getting married. Leo, a sour candy halfway to his mouth, froze. Cassie just shook her head, telling him it was nothing. They sat there together, and Leo began to feel a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He was terrified Cassie was about to give him an update on Julian, and he realized he didn't want to hear it, good or bad. After a moment, Cassie's voice grew heavy. She told him she had run into their old friend Joe a couple of days ago while she was out grabbing a bite to eat. Leo chewed slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. Cassie continued, her voice soft, saying Joe had told her that his wife, Claire, had passed away. Leo's eyes shot up, wide with disbelief. He thought he must have misheard. He grabbed Cassie's hand and asked what she had said. Cassie's eyes welled with tears as she choked out the words. The tumor had gotten worse. She had died in the hospital a few days after the new year, after efforts to save her had failed. Leo never thought he would find himself getting off a bus at this station again. He pushed through the crowded arrivals terminal. In June of '97, Claire had found him in a corner of this very same terminal and asked if he was lost. She was petite, with big, expressive eyes, and was holding a lunchbox from her shift at work when she had kindly asked if he needed help. Leo walked out of the bus station trying to remember the way to Joe's place. Cassie had told him Joe closed down the event planning business and took over his father's old tailor shop in a small alley near the elementary school. Leo, carrying his duffel bag, took a city bus. As he jumped off, he saw Joe leaning against the doorframe of the tailor shop, smoking a cigarette. From the back of the shop, Joe's mother yelled that he was getting smoke on the fabric and to take it outside if he had to smoke. Joe grinned and stood up, planning to walk to the street corner. As he turned, he saw Leo jogging across the crosswalk. Joe froze, the cigarette still between his fingers. Leo waved and called out to him. Joe pulled Leo into a rough hug, saying he must be seeing things and asking if it was really him. Leo nodded. Joe insisted on taking him to a nearby diner for a meal. He pinched Leo's cheek and remarked that he was still all height and no meat. Leo explained he was dancing at the TV station now and the food was great, but the daily workouts burned it all off. Joe said he'd heard from Cassie and that it was great Leo was doing so well. Leo smiled. Joe lowered his head and clinked his glass against Leo's, saying that was good. That afternoon, they went to Claire's grave. Leo bought a bouquet of chrysanthemums and placed them in front of the headstone. Joe squatted down and spoke to the stone, telling his wife that Leo was here to visit, asking her to look how tall he'd gotten. Leo's eyes turned red. The picture on the headstone showed Claire smiling, so happy. Leo thought she must be with their baby, Happy, who had lived for only 6.5 months. She would be raising him on the other side. They sat for a while on a bench near the cemetery. The weather was beautiful. Joe, chewing on the filter of an unlit cigarette, remarked that Julian's brother, David, had a baby boy, an American citizen from birth, and that his wife was pregnant again, due in December. Leo didn't respond. Joe awkwardly patted Leo's shoulder, saying that anyway, everyone was doing fine. They both knew one name was missing from the conversation, but neither of them brought it up. That evening, Joe walked Leo to the bus station. He stood with his hands in his pockets, making a self-deprecating joke that if it weren't for seeing Leo off, he would never come here. He couldn't bear to see that the ticket agent at window 4 had been replaced. Leo hugged Joe again, telling him to take care. As Leo was about to go through the gate with his ticket, Joe couldn't stop himself. He called out, asking if Leo could please not hate Julian. Leo turned back. Joe just looked defeated and shook his head at himself. Julian went through the gate, helping Sarah carry her luggage into the bus station. One of the more energetic boys in his 4th grade class, a kid nicknamed Pip, had been home alone a few days prior. His parents were separated, one working construction out of state, the other pulling double shifts at the plastics factory. Pip's mother, Sarah, had come home late one night to find him unconscious with a raging fever. She rushed him to the town clinic, but after a night, the fever hadn't broken. When Pip woke up, the vision in one of his eyes was gone. Julian learned about it when Sarah stood with Pip outside his apartment door, a frail mother and son standing silently like ghosts in the cluttered hallway. Sarah, in her 40s, had worked at the factory for over 20 years and hadn't been on a bus out of town in all that time. She was begging Julian to take her to the city where he was from, to see a specialist at the renowned eye hospital. Sarah had withdrawn all her savings and packed a large duffel bag before coming to him. That evening, Julian stood in line at the bus station and bought 3 tickets for the standing room only section. They spent the journey leaning against the luggage rack between 2 cars. It was late at night when they arrived. Julian took them to a 24-hour diner near the station for dinner. Sarah sat hunched over, looking overwhelmed at the brightly lit skyscrapers in the distance. The fluorescent lights overhead felt like a cold rain. Julian had no appetite. He sat on the plastic chair, gripped by a strange panic, like a criminal returning to the scene of the crime. At the hospital, after they had registered for an emergency visit, Sarah went to the nurse's station with her enormous glass water bottle to ask for hot water. Pip swung his legs and told Julian thank you. Julian ruffled his hair. Pip asked if he could tell the doctor it was no big deal, that it was okay if it couldn't be fixed. Julian asked him if it wasn't hard, not being able to see out of one eye. Pip looked up at him and asked if he'd seen the lump behind his mom's ear. It was a tumor, he explained. She said it was no big deal, that it was okay if it couldn't be treated. Pip leaned close to Julian's ear and whispered that it was really nice to take the bus into the city with his mom. Though, after the examination, they learned the test results would be ready the next day. Julian thought for a moment and decided to show them around the city. He hailed a taxi, and the 3 of them squeezed in. The car drove slowly down the main downtown thoroughfare. Pip, sandwiched between the 2 adults, was so afraid of missing the sights on his right side that he kept twisting his head back and forth like a little top. Julian smiled. He followed the boy's gaze to the streets that were so painfully familiar. He had been born and raised here, had ridden his bike countless times through these neighborhoods, to school, to the store, or just to wander aimlessly with someone. The taxi turned onto the riverfront drive. The summer night wind blew in through the open windows. Julian asked Pip if he wanted some candied apples. They got out and bought a bag. Julian lit a cigarette and leaned against a lamppost, watching Pip eat. He looked down, watching the ash fall onto his shoes. When he looked up again, he saw his old friend Kevin and a group of colleagues from the college coming out of a restaurant across the street. They had their arms around each other's shoulders, laughing loudly about something. Julian turned his face away. The city was just that small. By the time Julian got Sarah and Pip settled into a motel near the hospital, his back was soaked with sweat. He took off his shirt and sat heavily on the edge of the bed, staring into space for a long time. After a while, he thought about taking a painkiller, then realized in his haste to leave he'd forgotten his medication. His head throbbed all night, and he couldn't sleep. He stood at the window, watching the streetlights shut off with a click at 4 in the morning. The next day, Sarah decided to have Pip admitted to the hospital for treatment. Julian helped her with the paperwork and planned to head back to the small town. Sarah, her eyes red, gripped his hand and told him he was a good person. Julian managed a weak smile. He hoped she would never hear the stories about him. But if she did, maybe she would at least remember him as the good person who had helped her. On the bus back, the air was thick with a mixture of smells. Someone had a radio on, broadcasting the news. In August of 1999, there was a rumor that a major Y2K bug could crash the global financial system, and experts were scrambling to prevent a catastrophe. The entire bus of drowsy passengers pricked up their ears. What would happen when the clock struck midnight? The expert on the radio said it could be a minor inconvenience. Julian closed his eyes. The expert said it could also be the precursor to a new dark age. The bus rumbled through the countryside, through tunnels, carrying him back to the monotony of the small town. Wiping sweat from his forehead, Julian saw a TV in a shop window continuing the report. Another expert was proposing an initiative to preserve essential data. What should humanity save? Julian stopped and bought a small watermelon, then continued his slow walk back to his rented room. As he climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor of the self-built block, he accidentally kicked a pot with a dead orchid someone had left by their door. Julian looked up and saw someone squatting by his own door. He didn't know what it was about his doorway that seemed to attract people to stand there. The person saw Julian approaching and stirred, lifting a pair of exhausted eyes. Julian stopped, looking down at Leo, who was crouched there, clutching his duffel bag, looking up at him. Julian froze for a moment, then squatted down too. He reached out and touched Leo's head. Leo's eyes instantly turned red. The hallway was narrow, the floor damp. They remained silent for a long time, like two plants that had been growing there for years. Julian asked if it was really him. Leo collapsed into Julian's arms, tears streaming down his face. He had been sitting outside Julian's door all night. The day before, when Julian was helping Sarah and her son onto the bus, Leo had stopped at the departure gate. He didn't get on his own bus. He and Joe sat down in that same 24-hour diner near the station. Joe told Leo everything. After the news that he had been pretending to be a girl was exposed, the fallout had been immense. The Crestview apartment was basically acquired under false pretenses. The building's owner, Mr. Henderson, later bought the apartment back from them and made a large donation to the college, which was the only reason the school agreed to handle the matter quietly. Their past intimacy, a man's for another man, became twisted and perverse. It was something two men in this world were not allowed to do. To the public, Julian claimed he had coerced Leo. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital for treatment and medication. Now, if you asked anyone in that city, Julian was still the subject of a widely circulated, cruel joke. Joe's mother said he had truly made a poor choice of friends. Joe argued with her, asking if she didn't used to say all the time that he should be more like Julian and less of a slacker. His mother was speechless, muttering about who knew he was that kind of person. Joe wondered what kind of person Julian was. How could people who had known him for only a few minutes pass judgment? He had known Julian for 20 years and still wouldn't dare say what kind of person he was. Joe sighed and told Leo that he really wasn't that kind of person. He wasn't the kind of guy who would use you and then throw you away. He had worked to extricate Leo from the mess, to let him get away clean. Joe suspected that even when they were together, Julian had already been planning for the day everything would fall apart. He explained that's just how Julian was, sharp-tongued but with a completely different set of intentions in his heart. Leo sat slumped in his seat, his hands hanging limply, and didn't speak for a long time. After what felt like an eternity, his tears started to fall like a breaking dam. He lowered his head and asked Joe if Julian was still in the hospital. Joe shook his head and said no, he was out. Leo started with silent, racking sobs that turned into audible crying. He clutched his bag, remembering the look in Julian's eyes when he had pushed him out the door. He hadn't understood it then. Julian had seemed just as miserable, so why did he have to make him leave? He had slapped Julian. He had buried their photo deep in his duffel bag and hadn't looked at it since. He had surgically removed this person from his life while Julian was alone in a hospital, being medicated. Now, sobbing in Julian's arms, Leo let it all out. Julian helped him up, unlocked the door, and pulled him inside. Leo wrapped his arms around Julian's waist and refused to let go. Julian kissed the top of Leo's head and asked softly how he had found him. Leo, speaking in a jumble, said that Joe had told him and then he went to the school. But it was summer break, and then he asked his way from there to the bus station and back again. Julian teased him, saying that explained why he smelled of sweat. Leo let go, lifted his own arm to sniff it, then lifted his shirt to smell underneath. Julian watched him, this little animal sniffing himself all over. He gently stroked Leo's hair again, his voice cracking as he asked if he was sure he was Leo. Leo nodded fiercely. That night, Julian took Leo to the public shower on the ground floor. Leo, wearing Julian's t-shirt and shorts, ran upstairs still steaming and plopped down in front of a blue oscillating fan. Julian followed, telling him not to sit so close, to get off the dirty floor and sit on a chair. Leo jumped up and started rummaging through the small room. Julian chased after him, trying to dry his hair. Leo opened a blue pill box on the desk. It was filled with small white tablets. He paused. Julian closed the box and put it on the bookshelf. Leo turned around and told Julian that on the bus over, he had been thinking that if what they had was a sickness, then it was okay if he got sick too. Because this sickness didn't feel bad. Felt happy, very happy. It was good to be sick with him. Julian was stunned for a moment, then muttered what nonsense he was talking. Leo wrapped his arms around Julian's neck and asked if he could keep being sick with him. Julian thought back. He hadn't cried when his mother hit him with a ruler as a child. He hadn't cried when he failed his college entrance exams, losing a scholarship. He hadn't cried at any of the key moments of failure in his life. The only times he had cried in the last 2 years were in front of Leo. Julian draped the towel over Leo's head and pulled him close, telling him he was like a little piece of sticky rice cake. Leo looked confused. Julian's eyes reddened. He couldn't remember which day it was, but he had been standing outside the event planning office, and Joe was squatting beside him, shining his own leather shoes. Joe had said he now suspected Julian had only agreed to his plan in the first place because he had the hots for Leo. Julian had leaned against the door and rolled his eyes, calling him crazy. Leo, with half a piece of bread in his mouth, had rushed out of the dressing room, looking for Julian, before someone else called him back, grabbing his arm. Julian, standing at the door, watched him and thought of a small piece of sticky rice cake, softened over a winter fire, easy to pull away but always sticking back. He had actually taken Leo to a little stall that made exceptionally good rice cake soup. That night, the little rice cake, Leo stuck to Julian all evening. Outside, the last of the summer thunderstorms raged. Julian was afraid the rain would blow in, so he closed the window. The room became hot and stuffy. Leo draped a leg over him, twirling a strand of Julian's hair with his finger. Julian complained about the heat but didn't push him away. Leo had brought a small cake, but it had almost completely melted. They shared it anyway. Leo said that this past year, whenever something good happened, he would buy himself a cupcake. The last time, when he got the second highest score in his night class exam, he ran to the bakery and bought the last 2 cupcakes. He went home, woke Cassie up, and dragged her to the 7th floor rooftop to eat them. Cassie had cursed him out between bites. Julian got up to pour Leo a glass of water from his thermos. Leo, wearing only his boxers, got up and stuck to him as he poured. Julian sighed, telling him to move away, that the water was scalding hot. Leo said okay and stood behind him. They moved around the tiny 100-square-foot room, then lay back down on the narrow wooden bed. Julian had never felt the room was this small before. Leo played with the watch Julian had taken off, then climbed up again to search the bookshelf for a book, saying he wanted to perform a story reading for him now that he could recognize a lot more words. Julian listened as he read an essay like a first grader, pointing at the words with his index finger. After a while, Julian, staring at his face, suddenly took the book from his hand, placed it on the nightstand, and pulled Leo in to kiss him. Leo rubbed his cheek against the short stubble on Julian's chin. They held each other, kissing affectionately, pausing for a moment only to pepper each other's faces with more kisses. That night, they held each other and whispered for half the night. Later, Leo said he was hungry. Julian, bare-chested, pulled on a pair of pants and went to the public kitchen to cook noodles. He came back holding 2 bowls. Leo was listlessly half-draped over the side of the bed, poking at the fan. A single, bare bulb hanging from a wire cast a warm yellow light over his head. For a moment, Julian felt like he was back in the Crestview apartment. When Leo saw him, he jumped up with a whoop and shouted about eating noodles. They each held a bowl and sat back on the bed. Leo slurped his noodles quickly, dunking his fried egg into the broth, then scooping it out and biting off half in one go. Julian watched him eat, muttering about the soup splashing everywhere, telling him not to get it on the sheets, asking if he was trying to pick a fight. Leo just smiled at him, completely unabashed. Julian wiped the bamboo mat with a tissue. The next day, they were woken up by noise from downstairs. Leo sat up, his head so heavy with sleep that it dropped onto Julian's chest. He asked what was going on downstairs. Julian, his eyes still closed, explained that on Sundays, a lot of people set up stalls in the vacant lot below his window, a sort of weekend flea market for used but functional items. It had started with just a few people swapping things and grown from there. Leo climbed over Julian, slipped on some sandals, pushed open the window, and yawned. Below, along the abandoned railroad tracks, 2 long rows of stalls were already set up. Julian got up and stood beside him. A few kids running around on the tracks suddenly pointed up at Julian as if they'd seen a shooting star, shouting his teacher's name, asking if he lived here. Julian saw the students from his class, their mouths greasy from snacks, standing in a line on the tracks, waving excitedly at him. Leo, like a fool, raised his hand and waved back. Julian pushed the window shut. After they got dressed, Leo still managed to drag Julian down to browse the flea market. Leo touched and looked at things at every stall, constantly marveling at how cool it all was. After a while, Julian's headache started to return. Leo, entertaining himself, walked slowly along one of the rails, his arms outstretched for balance. Julian stopped behind him, too pained to chase after him. When he looked up again, Leo had already turned around and was running back towards him. Leo had to take the afternoon bus back to the city for work. He stood by the apartment door with his duffel bag, clinging to Julian. Julian felt if Leo hugged any tighter, he would squeeze his internal organs out through his throat. Julian kissed the corner of Leo's mouth and said he would walk him to the station. They walked slowly all the way there. Julian bought a ticket at the counter. The terminal was bustling with people. They held hands secretly behind their backs. Leo watched the scrolling red timetable on the big screen, then finally pulled his hand away to grip his ticket, ready to go through the gate. Julian stood up and followed him. When Leo went through the gate, Julian followed him through too. Leo looked at him, confused. Julian, hands in his pockets, shrugged and said he still had half a month of vacation, so he thought he might as well. Leo's mouth split into a wide grin. He grabbed Julian's sleeve, wanting to shout but not daring to, just bouncing on the balls of his feet and whispering that if no one was around, he would kiss him right now. That day, they sat together on the hard seats of the bus, watching the scenery rumble past the window. The train moved at 50 miles per hour. There was a 3-hour distance between their 2 cities. After that, they would often take this express line to see each other during their brief free time. Julian loved walking into the arrivals hall after getting off the bus and seeing Leo in the middle of the dense crowd, waving enthusiastically at him. The PA system would be announcing something about lost and found. Julian would walk over, put an arm around Leo, and guide him towards the exit. Leo would talk nonstop about his advanced culture class at the community college, that he was even learning to write essays now. A few days later, when Julian came to see him for the weekend, Leo, wearing a tank top, jumped out of bed and rummaged through a drawer for a long time, finally pulling out a love poem he had written for Julian. Julian leaned back against the headboard, hands behind his head, and laughed, telling him to let him mentally prepare first, that he was a little scared. Leo stood there and recited 2 lines with great emotion. Julian was already laughing so hard he nearly fell off the bed. Leo was not pleased. That night, Leo shyly mentioned that because he knew Julian was coming this week, he had bought some tools for practical learning. Julian, intrigued, asked him how he had told the store clerk what he wanted. Leo tilted his head back, his face turning red up to his neck as he recalled the moment. His face growing even redder as he muttered that he just said it, that he was an adult. Julian leaned in and kissed him, agreeing that yes, he was an adult. He stroked Leo's calf and pulled him closer, kissing him. Leo clumsily reached up and took off his tank top, straddling Julian and kissing his mouth. Julian lowered his head and kissed the small peak on Leo's chest. Leo let out a low moan. He fumbled with Julian's boxers and took him in his hand. Julian asked if he had been practicing by himself. Leo, focused on his task, absent-mindedly replied that he was an adult. Julian arched his back, releasing into Leo's hand. He turned Leo over and parted his legs. Leo shyly tried to escape towards the head of the bed. As Julian entered him, for some reason, he thought of the mountain tunnels the express line passed through on the way here. You pass through a dark passage and see a stretch of bright blue sea, then pass through another and see another, a mix of light and dark. Leo cried out, his nails digging hard into Julian's back. That night, when they went downstairs to have dinner with Cassie, Leo's face still had a strange flush. Cassie chewed on the end of her chopstick, watching Leo. He would take a bite of food, look at Julian, take a bite of rice, then look up and smile at Julian again. Cassie finally couldn't take it anymore and asked what was going on with them. Leo introduced Julian to the other dancers as his distant cousin. They were careful to maintain a slight distance in front of others. After work, Leo would bring Julian to group dinners. They would sit at opposite ends of a large round table, and through the smoky haze of the restaurant, their eyes would meet, and they would smile at each other. Leo grew up quickly that year. He became more and more adept at talking and getting along with people. Just before Cassie and Jenna were set to leave for Europe, Leo went to a shop and picked out a jade good luck charm for her. The small pendant was strung on black onyx beads. Cassie bit it, thinking that with Leo's clueless face, someone could have sold him a piece of plastic and he wouldn't have known the difference. But after biting it, she didn't say anything. She rubbed the jade in her palm and demanded he put it on for her. Leo moved behind her and fastened it around her neck. When he sat back down in front of her, he saw that she was crying. Wiping tears from her chin, Cassie grabbed Leo's hand. She said that getting through everything to this day, she sometimes thought she was lucky it was with Leo, because Leo never complained about anything. He would be thrilled with a meal that was just slightly better than the last one. When they would dance on the street all day and not make a single dollar, they would go to the farmer's market and pick through the discarded vegetable bins for anything edible. They would wash it, take it back to the tiny kitchen in their building, and stew a pot of vegetable soup. They would stand together in the kitchen, each with a bowl, drinking it down. Outside, water would drip from the eaves, the floor so damp it felt like a river could spring from it. Back then, Cassie had sometimes wished for the end of the world, just so this life would finally be over. She looked down, touching the jade pendant Leo had given her. She opened her arms and hugged Leo, patting his head, saying they both had to survive. She asked him to wait for her to come back next year. Leo nodded. The day Cassie left, she had a lot of luggage. She was bent over by a huge duffel bag that looked like a small mountain on her back. Julian and Leo helped her carry the rest of her suitcases onto the bus. Cassie squeezed herself in by the door. Just as the bus was about to pull away, she suddenly leaned out and said something to Julian. The driver up front cursed as he closed the automatic door. Cassie, surrounded by her luggage, watched from the window as Julian and Leo stood there, waving goodbye to her. Winter was approaching. The bus moved slowly over the uneven gravel road. Cassie hadn't read many books. She tried to imagine what winter would be like on the other side of the world, as if another season was hidden deep inside this one. Leo asked Julian what Cassie had said to him. Julian put an arm around his shoulder but didn't speak. They walked slowly back to their apartment. Later, when Leo had to go to the studio for work, and Julian had to catch a bus back to his town, they locked themselves in a small meeting room on the first floor of the TV station and kissed for a while. Julian wiped Leo's lips with his finger and said she had told him that whatever their relationship was, he had to make sure Leo was happy. Leo wasn't a person who was easily unhappy. But after rehearsing for the Macau handover celebration performance for over a month, he was suddenly replaced by another dancer just before the final dress rehearsal. Leo sat in the backstage area, his hair damp with sweat, clutching his costume and staring into space. Another dancer passing by whispered that it was because the other guy had an uncle who was a director at the production center, and he didn't. Leo didn't understand what he was talking about. Back in his hometown of Bridgeport, he might have had a few uncles who were good fishermen, but after the flood in '98, the entire village had been washed away. He didn't even know if his uncles were still alive. He had tried to contact his family but couldn't get through. Leo stood by the payphone outside a convenience store, turning in circles, suddenly realizing he didn't know who else in the world he could call. He could only call Julian. Julian ran down to the corner store below his building to take the call. Leo, bundled up in his jacket, his voice muffled, told Julian he was unhappy. Julian asked how he knew. Leo said that when he was unhappy, even his breathing seemed to say he was unhappy. Leo laughed. He sniffled and told Julian about being replaced and the uncle. Julian explained that it meant the other guy had connections. Leo didn't know what that meant. He just felt that spending so much effort only to not be able to perform was incredibly disheartening. He kicked at an empty plastic bag on the ground. During that time, everyone at the station was busy with the handover ceremony and the New Year's Eve gala. Leo was suddenly idle, relegated to helping move props. Before the ceremony, everyone had to fly to the main venue in another city for a rehearsal. Someone left their ID in their locker and called Leo to find it. Leo found it and ran, sweating, to deliver it to the airport shuttle bus. The rest of the dance troupe was lounging casually by the bus, chatting. When Cassie called him from overseas and heard about it, she said he was truly an idiot, asking how it was that the moment she was gone, people could bully him and he wouldn't even know it. Leo defended himself, saying the person was in a hurry, and since he was at the studio anyway, he just brought it to them. Cassie continued to scold him, saying if there was a Good Samaritan award, she would nominate him, asking why the person couldn't have just run back to get it themselves, that it wasn't that far. Leo muttered something under his breath. Cassie shouted that she heard him, that he had called her annoying. That weekend, when Leo went to see Julian, he told him about the incident. Julian was in the public kitchen, making a bowl of sesame paste for Leo as a late-night snack. Leo, his mouth black from the paste, sat indignantly at Julian's desk, telling the story. Julian squinted and wiped a smear of sesame paste from his own face. Leo stared for a second, then clutched his stomach and burst out laughing. Julian said helplessly that he was really something else. That night, they went down to the public shower. Julian used a big bar of green soap to wash both their pairs of underwear, wringing them out and placing them in a basin. Leo, having put on his pajamas, helped him carry the basin and open the shower door. Leo exhaled a cloud of warm air into the cold and shivered. Julian put an arm around him and said on the count of 3, they would run back, asking if he was ready. Leo, holding the basin, bounced on his feet and excitedly said he was ready. Julian counted to 2 and then took off by himself. Leo stood there stunned for 2 seconds, then chased after him, furiously shouting that he was a liar. Julian laughed so hard his stomach hurt, waiting for him in the stairwell of the building. Leo ran up and butted him in the chest with his head. Julian held him and, seeing no one around, kissed him a couple of times. They stood under the dim light. Julian touched Leo's face and told him to remember that he should only be a good person when it doesn't harm him. There are many people and things in the world not worth his sacrifice. Leo nodded, not fully understanding. Later, Julian would think about Leo's character. He was born in a place like Bridgeport, had encountered so many difficult people and situations, yet he remained pure. Even if Leo had understood his that day, he probably still would have run to help. Before the Macau handover, the radio show Words for the End of the World decided not to sensationalize doomsday theories anymore, and the show ended that week. That night, the station's call-in line nearly melted down. The day before, Julian had said he would come see Leo, but his school was having an anniversary celebration. He was the 5th grade homeroom teacher that semester and couldn't get away. Pip had come back from the hospital before the school year started. His eye hadn't healed. Sarah asked Julian to keep it a secret, afraid it would affect Pip's chances of getting married later. Julian agreed, but the story about Pip's eye spread through the school anyway. Pip told his friends himself. Because his eyesight was poor, he started wearing glasses. Everyone wanted to play with his glasses. Pip dramatically told them the story of his eye and decided to sing Sailor by Zheng Jihua at the school anniversary. Before the performance, a group of elementary school kids gathered in the classroom, secretly listening to the final episode of Words for the End of the World on a radio. That day, Julian didn't bother to stop them. Pip ran up and asked Julian if they could use the phone in his office to call the hotline. Julian crossed his arms, intrigued, and asked what wish he had. Pip adjusted his glasses, rubbed his hands together, and said he wanted to do well on his exams and go to college in the city where Julian was from. That day, Pip perched on the edge of Julian's office chair, clutching the red phone receiver for a long time, but he never got through. Meanwhile, Leo was downstairs at the TV station, trying to call Julian's office. He had just gotten his December salary and wanted to buy Julian a down vest, so he needed to ask his size. Because the line was constantly busy, Leo tried for a while, then hung up, dejected. He decided not to go to the mall that day. He planned to grab a bowl of noodles at a nearby stall and then go back to his apartment. The people performing at the handover ceremony had already flown to the venue. Leo sat across the street from the TV broadcast tower and ordered a bowl of noodles with peppers and pork. The evening rush hour crowd rode by on their bicycles, bells ringing. Leo idly wondered if he should learn to ride a bike too. He lowered his head and ate his noodles, drinking the last drop of soup. When he looked up, he saw a crowd had gathered at the intersection. Leo picked up his bag and walked over to see what was happening. A husband and wife had gotten off the riverfront bus near the downtown broadcast tower. The man carried a knockoff brand sports bag. The woman held a thermos, which was covered in a hand-knitted cozy. They walked hesitantly and awkwardly through the automatic doors of a bank and sat down. A security guard approached them and asked if they were there to make a deposit. The woman clutched her thermos and looked up at him timidly. When it was their turn, the man, holding the sports bag, sat down at the counter. He slowly pulled a freshly sharpened kitchen knife out of the bag and said politely, in a thick accent, "Hello, please give me the money." In the news footage that night, after the police arrived, the man was pressed against the wall. The kitchen knife had rolled to the side of the door. The automatic door opened and closed, opened and closed. The woman's bright red thermos cozy lay on the floor, stepped on by countless people coming and going. They were possibly the world's most inept bank robbers. It was said they had sat quietly by the river for a long time before the robbery. That day, they didn't hurt anyone with the knife. The man, holding the knife to a teller as a hostage, stood by the bank's automatic door and said, very politely, "Please just give me some money for food." Leo recognized the accent. It was from Bridgeport. The crowd of onlookers grew larger. Leo pushed his way out and called out in the same accent, "Brother, I'll give you some money. Just put the knife down." A strange smile appeared on the man's sun-darkened face. He shook his head. Leo pulled 2 bills from his pocket and waved them, saying he would give him the money. He slowly approached. The teller was already crying silently, her legs weak as she leaned against the automatic door. Leo walked up the steps to the bank entrance, getting closer to the man. The man's face reminded him of his uncles who were good fishermen. He tossed the money onto the second-to-last step. As the man bent down to get it, Leo quickly pulled the teller away. The man froze for a second. The surrounding crowd screamed and scattered. Leo looked up at the man, wanting to say something more, but the man had already rushed forward and pushed him down the steps, then went to pick up the money Leo had left. Julian always thought that, given Leo's character, he surely would have tried to persuade the couple to take the money and get a hot meal first. But after the couple got the money, they were subdued by the arriving police. The evening news reported the incident. The next day, the city paper reported on the heroic actions of Leo, with the news item right next to a photo of the Macau handover performance troupe. They said this heroic Mr. L, a 20-year-old man from a fishing village in Bridgeport, had come to the city to work alone. He had even performed as a street dancer in the night market. Such a person, who had it so tough, still stepped up to help others in their time of need. The small, block text article summarized Leo's short life, as if his grueling 30-plus hour train ride to escape Bridgeport and his struggle to survive were all leading up to this moment. To be the person who had it tough but still stepped up in someone else's crisis. The night of the incident, Julian rushed over on the train. The bank entrance was a small, steep set of steps. Leo had fallen almost straight down, his head hitting the corner of a step. The next day, when people from the TV station came to visit, Julian nearly grabbed each of them by the collar and threw them out of the hospital. Leo underwent a full-body examination. His other bodily functions were fine, but due to the head injury, he developed temporary aphasia. The doctors didn't know if it would become permanent or if he would recover on his own after some time. Julian checked Leo out of the hospital. He and Leo sat on the bus, looking out at the receding streetscape. In the last few days of 1999, the world went on as usual. There were no signs of imminent collapse or explosion. Julian planned to take Leo to a better hospital to see a specialist. He was in Leo's small rented room, bending down to pack a suitcase, when Leo hugged him from behind. Julian paused and asked what kind of hug this was. The room was silent. Leo couldn't speak. Julian asked if it was a comforting hug. Leo rubbed his face back and forth against his back. Julian then asked if it was a thank you hug. Leo shook his head again. Julian asked if it was an apology hug. Leo bumped his forehead against his spine. Julian turned around and hugged him, teasing him not to apologize. From now on, he should only hug him when he wanted to say he loved him, otherwise it would get confusing. Leo leaned on Julian's shoulder, his eyes turning red. The night the new millennium arrived, Julian and Leo got off a train in Philadelphia and brushed past crowds of revelers. Julian carried a suitcase in one hand and held Leo's wrist with the other. The crowd followed a dragon and lion dance troupe through the city center. A model of the Eiffel Tower erected in front of a department store had 2000 emblazoned on it. The year 2000 had arrived on schedule. They moved against the tide of people, asking if any motels were still open where they could stay the night. Fireworks suddenly lit up the sky. Julian and Leo looked up at the same time. Leo's memory of the millennium's arrival was of those fireworks blooming over the narrow city streets. On a night with humidity close to 90%, Julian led him by the hand, wading through the streets of the bustling city against the flow of people. Leo wondered if someone could look down from above on this city street, Would they be able to pick him and Julian out from the sesame seed-sized crowd? They stayed in a motel not far from the hospital. After unpacking, they were exhausted but couldn't fall asleep right away. Julian held Leo and told him where they could go sightseeing after the doctor's appointment the next day. Leo nodded happily. It was Julian's first time in Philadelphia. He bought a city map at a newsstand and took Leo around. Before they left, worried about getting separated, Julian bought Leo a small red whistle at a convenience store. Leo hung it around his neck. They got lost wandering in a downtown department store, leaned against the railing of a riverside park, looking at the skyline across the water, and brushed past students just getting out of school on a side street. The two of them ducked into an alley. Leo saw a metal railing used for drying clothes and instinctively wanted to put his leg up on it to stretch. Julian tried to pull him back, muttering about how dirty the railing was, how there was rust, telling him to look at his pant leg. Leo suddenly turned around and mischievously blew the whistle at him. Julian froze for a second, then scolded him, saying so that's what the whistle was for. Later, whenever they argued, it would be like this. Julian would say something, and Leo would start puffing out his cheeks and blowing the whistle. He also bought a stack of white note cards. He would frown, write a message, and hold it up to argue back with Julian. "You look like a flounder when you're angry." Julian, half laughing, half annoyed, would snatch the paper from his hand, asking who looked like a flounder, telling him he was getting bold now. He would push Leo against the motel room wall and tickle his waist. Leo would grimace and laugh, trying to pry Julian's hands away. Julian would pull him into a hug, burying his head in Leo's neck and asking if he wasn't afraid of the flounder kissing him. Leo, his eyes half closed from being kissed, would giggle and shake his head. In the first spring of the new millennium, Julian and Leo were constantly on trains going to see doctors. They would return from a strange city with a similar-looking diagnosis and a pile of local snacks. Leo would cheerfully distribute the snacks to his colleagues at the dance troupe, writing on the packages where they were from. During that time, Julian also bought a used film camera at a Kodak shop. It was plastic, light, and cheap. They were like two tourists, taking pictures everywhere as they traveled between cities. In every photo, Leo wore the little red whistle, smiling in front of some landmark. Just before the Lunar New Year, someone told Julian about an old traditional Chinese medicine doctor who had supposedly cured this kind of condition. Julian and Leo packed their bags and set off again. They took a train, then a bus, and then a local farmer's tractor to finally find the doctor. The clinic was so old it felt like a dream of the past. Leo sat across from the consultation desk, looking at the wall of small drawers behind the old doctor. The doctor would take herbs from the drawers, weigh them on a scale, and wrap them in oiled paper. The doctor had white hair and sat by the window, like another large, dried piece of medicinal herbs stored on a chair. He took Leo's pulse, rubbed his temples, and then wrote a prescription on a piece of paper with a brush pen. He would hand the paper to his son, who would grab some astragalus root, goji berries, and other things and place them in the center of the oiled paper. Every morning, Leo would unwrap a packet of herbs and squat by the coal stove on the balcony, simmering them in a clay pot. When it was done, he would pour it into his small thermos and take it to work. The bank near the TV station where the incident had happened had returned to normal business 3 days later. The story of Leo's heroism was talked about in the city for a few days, then was replaced by fresher gossip. Leo, carrying his little thermos, would get off the bus, cross the street, and walk into the TV station. A few days later, Julian would come to see him again. They would take an early morning train to go back to that clinic for a follow-up visit. These were things the city paper was no longer interested in reporting, including how, after traveling to so many cities and trying both Western and traditional medicine, there was still no improvement, yet they still held a large bundle of herbs like a bundle of hope as they boarded a late-night train. Leo bit into a large sesame rice ball filled with crushed peanuts and stared out the window. Julian took his other empty hand. The train was packed with people heading home for the spring festival rush. Their hands were held together behind their backs. Leo had never thought about topics like fate, so he had never questioned what the purpose was of fate possibly making him unable to speak for the rest of his life. He just looked at the plastic bag of herbs at his feet and wanted to tell Julian that maybe they should just stop. He wanted to write it down, but Julian held his hand tightly. Later, Leo got tired and fell asleep on the train. When they were about to arrive, Julian woke him up, picked up the bag of herbs, and led him off the train. They squeezed through the station hall, got on a bus, and went back to Leo's rented room. The bus turned onto the night streets. The restaurants on the street were already decorated with large red lanterns and New Year's couplets. That meant the new year was coming again. The TV station would be closing for the holidays in a few days. Julian mentioned that maybe they should find time to go to the department store to buy new clothes for the new year. He asked about the wool coat Leo had liked last time, suggesting they should just buy it, that they should dress well for the new year. Leo shook his head, his knees together. He knew Julian didn't have much money left, and neither did he. Leo took out a piece of paper and wrote that they should stop going to hospitals after the holidays. Julian stared at the words on the paper, stunned. Leo grinned at him. Julian said not to worry about the money, that no matter what, Julian's brother David and Mr. Henderson. Leo shook Julian's hand and wrote on the paper, "Because I'm a little tired." They got off the bus. Leo was still holding his bag of herbs. They passed the small diner at the bottom of their building. Leo pointed at his stomach, saying he was hungry. They sat down and ordered 2 bowls of wonton soup. Julian barely ate, watching Leo eat with his head down. Leo still struggled with chopsticks, sending the small wontons flying everywhere. Julian couldn't stand it and was about to snap, telling him to look at himself. Leo grabbed his whistle and blew a sharp toot. Julian backed down, muttering, "Fine, eat however you want." Leo ate with great gusto. Julian put his chopsticks down on his bowl and asked him softly where he wanted to spend New Year's Eve this year, that it was all the same to him. Leo looked up, seeming to think for a moment. Julian flicked his cheek and said, "Where he liked best." Leo took the paper out of his pocket again and wrote Crestview Apartments. If you were to ask him his favorite place to spend the new year, it would definitely be Crestview. Julian stared at the name on the paper, thinking of the plague-like rumors about them that had spread through that city. But that day, he picked up the piece of paper, slightly damp from the wonton soup, and suddenly thought, what did it matter? Julian smiled at Leo and said okay. Then they would go back to Crestview for the holiday. On New Year's Eve of the new millennium, Julian's old neighbor, Kevin, was walking up the stairs to his own apartment when he saw someone in Julian's unit across the way pull open the curtains. Julian had shamelessly asked Mr. Henderson for the key back and opened the door to the Crestview apartment. The furniture inside was covered in dust cloths. Julian pulled open the curtains and pushed open the windows to air out the living room. Leo followed behind, carrying a suitcase. He cheerfully placed the newly bought New Year's couplets and a fruit platter on the coffee table. Then the two of them started cleaning the house. That day, they cleaned for a long time, tidying the 500-square-foot apartment inside and out. The people in Crestview quickly knew they were back. Within half a day, the whole city would know they were back, and that they had come back together. Julian put some deli-bought cured meats onto a clean plate. Leo was in the bedroom making the bed. After spreading the new 4-piece bedding set he had brought, he lay down on the bed and did a couple of snow angels. When Julian came into the room, he saw him with his arms and legs spread out, rowing an imaginary boat. Julian lay down beside him and asked if he was happy to be home. Leo nodded. Julian smiled. That night, their New Year's Eve dinner consisted of a few dishes from a restaurant. While eating, Leo couldn't help but turn his head to watch TV. Julian sipped some white wine and looked at the New Year's poster they had just hung in the living room. Leo's taste was still questionable. Julian looked at it for a long time and finally couldn't help but say that it was truly ugly, and that using such wide plastic tape to stick it up would rip off a chunk of the wall when they took it down. Leo, picking at his rice, pretended to be deaf. Julian pinched his cheek and asked if this was his new trick to deal with him. Leo flicked his finger away and pointed at the TV, implying Julian was interrupting his show. Julian smiled helplessly. Joe found out about it on New Year's Eve. The two notorious madmen were riding their bikes to the riverfront to watch the fireworks. They squeezed into the crowd, watching the fireworks bloom. Leo couldn't shout, but he jumped up and down excitedly. After the fireworks display, they rode their bikes home. Joe felt it was some kind of declaration. The world was crazy, but they were perfectly normal. They stopped at a street corner and bought a money tree, planning to put it on the coffee table. Julian said they were only staying until after the holidays, and the tree would die with no one to look after it. Leo, holding the pot, insisted on buying it. So they bought it. After the holidays, they gave the money tree to Joe to take care of. That day, Leo sat on the back of Julian's bike, holding a short, squat money tree. If he could sing right now, he would be singing a happy song. They rode into Crestview, parked their bikes, and went upstairs, still joking and roughhousing. Julian took 2 sets of pajamas from the suitcase and led Leo into the bathroom to take a shower. He sprayed Leo's back with the shower head, then helped him lather up with soap. As he was soaping him, he hugged Leo and kissed him against the bathroom wall. The shower head was dropped in the tub, spraying water everywhere. That day, the bathroom was a complete mess. Julian held Leo, kissing him for a long time in the Crestview bathroom. Their lips parted for a moment, and Julian asked Leo if they could have a practical learning session here. Leo nodded. Julian put him down and nearly slipped as he stepped out of the tub. He threw on his pajama top and rushed through the living room to get the practical learning tools, then rushed back. Leo was sitting in the warm water of the tub, waiting for him. That day, Leo braced himself against the bathroom wall as Julian entered him. Afterwards, he shook his head, indicating that it was too cold and tiring like this, and he didn't want to do it again next time. Julian died laughing. He wrapped him in a bathrobe and carried him out, saying, "Fine, whatever you say." They stayed in Crestview for about 10 days, using up Leo's vacation. Most of the time, they just stayed in the apartment, talking, eating, and sleeping. Leo would practice his dance fundamentals in the living room. Julian would sit on the sofa with his legs crossed, looking at his lesson plans. Leo brought back all the souvenirs they had bought in the cities they had visited for medical treatment and arranged them in the living room. When Julian was tired of lesson planning, he would look up and see the line of small trinkets on the TV stand. For some reason, it reminded him of the quote posted on the wall of the psychiatric hospital. "I travel to understand my own geography." After finishing his stretches, Leo jumped onto the sofa and turned on the TV to watch the weather forecast. Julian gathered his papers and went to the balcony to collect the clothes hanging outside to dry. He leaned against the balcony railing, looking at the lush camphor trees in Crestview that were green all year round. The air carried the scent of other people's cooking. He turned his head and saw Leo sitting cross-legged on the sofa, watching the weather forecast under the warm light of the living room with the seriousness of someone watching the evening news. Leo seemed to sense Julian's gaze and turned his head, waving at him. Julian, holding the clothes, walked back into the living room and sat down beside Leo. They folded clothes together, watching the post-holiday temperature changes in the cities they had visited. The city they were in would have a relatively warm and sunny week ahead. It was a very bright, warm winter. After dinner, Leo wanted to go for a walk downstairs. They strolled for a while on the small road near the college. The road had been repaired and was much flatter and cleaner now. Julian focused on watching Leo walk ahead of him, ignoring the many pairs of eyes that stared at them as if they were seeing ghosts. When it was time to pack up and go back, Leo was very reluctant. He patted the bed in Crestview, patted his favorite TV, and said goodbye to them. Because of a school matter, Julian got off the train in his own town, separating from Leo. That week, they were both busy with their own things. During his preparations for the start of the school year, Julian received a phone call. A colleague of Leo's was calling to tell Julian that because of his heroic act, the TV station's spring gala wanted him to perform a solo dance. Leo, next to the phone, wrote for his colleague to see, "I'm so happy." The colleague relayed to Julian that he was so happy. Leo wrote again, "Remember to watch." The colleague told the phone, "He wants you to remember to watch." Julian laughed and said he would definitely watch. In fact, he was determined to watch it live. That day, Julian called Joe and another friend, Michael, and even his brother David, who couldn't see the live broadcast. He himself went to the school security office to watch on their TV. When Leo appeared in the center of the TV screen, Julian almost shouted. He glanced at the old security guard next to him, cleared his throat, and clenched his fist in embarrassment. Leo wore a light blue tunic and pants, his eyes looking into the distance as he began to spin. Julian stared at the screen, lost in thought, and remembered a few years ago at Michael's wedding. Below the stage were more than a dozen tables of steaming wedding banquet food. Waiters squeezed through the aisles, placing a platter of braised pork on a table. The 2 rows of dancers on the stage, wearing tight red jackets, also looked like pieces of hot braised pork. Leo had been in the second row on the far right. After the banquet, Joe had the performance troupe eat at the restaurant as well. Afterwards, a group of braised pork walked out the side door, chattering as they passed Joe and Julian sitting on the steps. At that time, Julian had just put out his cigarette, slung his jacket over his shoulder, and was about to leave. He and Leo, one getting into Joe's van, the other turning to the street corner to ride his own bike. The van turned left onto the main road. Julian turned right and rode back to the factory workers' dormitory. At that time, they had no idea that a long story belonging to them would begin at the end of the 20th century. Leo's inability to speak remained the same. He was unwilling to continue traveling around seeking treatment, and Julian didn't push him. After school started, Julian's work became busier. They couldn't talk on the phone, and occasionally on weekends they both had their own things to do. Leo somehow came up with the idea of having a long-distance bus driver carry letters for him. One of the long-distance bus drivers was also from Bridgeport and had been working in the city for over 10 years. He had even seen the report about Leo in the newspaper. Leo would take a letter from his cloth bag and hand it to him. When the bus arrived at the station in the town where Julian was, the driver would leave the letter at the ticket window. Julian always felt like they had regressed to an era before modern communication. When one person missed another, they could only write letters. Those letters had to fly over mountains and streets to be seen by another pair of eyes, which would then open the envelope. What Julian saw were Leo's scrawled characters, the font size varying, written with great force on the letter paper. In his letters, Leo wrote that the troop leader had recently made him a group leader. Leo, with this tiny bit of authority, was as motivated as if he had been injected with adrenaline. The leader assigned a few new people to his group, and he would tirelessly help them practice their basic skills and refine their movements every day. After work, he would even help colleagues who had just moved from out of town look for apartments. Over time, some people started to take his kindness for granted. When Julian came to see him, he sat on Leo's bed and told him that if he was tired, he didn't have to help them. He could just say he was tired. Did he understand? Leo opened his mouth and made a sound, then went around Julian to get a pen and wrote, "Not tired." Julian pinched his cheek and asked what time he had been getting home lately. He mentioned that in the last letter, he had said he missed the last bus and had to walk for 2 hours to get home. He asked if he was an idiot. Leo started puffing his cheeks and blowing his whistle at him again. Julian pulled the whistle from his mouth and pointed at Leo, saying that his inability to speak was also because he ran out to help people and didn't learn his lesson. Wasn't it? Leo fell silent, turning his back to him. Julian, realizing he had misspoken, hugged him from behind and said that wasn't what he meant, that he knew the incident was an accident. Leo remained stiff with anger. Julian knew Leo's character. If someone held his hand and asked for help, he would happily agree. After helping, those people wouldn't necessarily treat him any better. The new dancers were later assigned to other groups and started hanging out with other people. Leo still diligently led his own group. Some people didn't know why Leo couldn't speak. After the taping of a show, they were packing up to go home. A few people in Leo's group, knowing his good temper, joked with him that a prop had been forgotten backstage and asked him to go get it. Leo, sweating, ran into the backstage area to look for it. They locked the heavy iron door behind him. Leo, holding the prop, knocked on the door. Because he couldn't shout, he was terrified and kept knocking. The group members, feeling they had gone on long enough, opened the door. For the first time, Leo lost his temper with them. He changed back into his own clothes and walked out of the TV station building without a word. The weather that day was gloomy, with a lingering spring chill. Leo, wrapped in his jacket, stood dazed at a crossroads. After hastily crossing the street, he looked for a payphone to call Julian. He desperately wanted to vent his frustrations to Julian, but he couldn't speak. That day, Leo just stood by the payphone for a long time, clutching a coin. He opened his mouth, trying to make a sound, but his ears only heard a few strained noises from his throat. The next day, the group members who had played the prank apologized to him. Leo smiled, turned around, and got his dance costume. That evening, the bus driver left the letter Julian had asked him to bring at the TV station's front desk. The receptionist called out to Leo as he was leaving the building. Every character Julian wrote was angular, sitting on the lined paper. He told Leo that the light bulb in his rented room had burned out a few days ago, and he had replaced it with a very bright one. He had gone to get the last roll of film he had shot developed. Leo was perfectly fine dancing for the camera, but when it came to posing for a photo, he was still very stiff. Julian wrote that in the photos he was a hard little piece of sticky rice cake, even when he was angry. Leo chuckled. He flipped through the photos Julian had put in the envelope. The streets of the cities they had visited together. Leo looking up at a dovecot on someone's roof, pigeons flying in flocks across the sky. Julian had framed him and the flying pigeons together in that photo. At the end of March, the bus driver didn't bring a letter from Julian. He brought a person to see Leo. Leo had just finished taking off his makeup and was still in his performance costume when he came down. Leo stood in the lobby, stunned. The driver had brought one of his uncles who was a good fisherman. Leo couldn't speak, and his uncle couldn't read. The driver acted as a translator in the middle. The uncle said that after the '98 flood, he had left Bridgeport to work elsewhere for a few years. The flood had pushed the entire town of Bridgeport to a place that was now a 3-hour drive away. Leo's parents had survived the flood, but his father had disappeared soon after. 2 years later, which was not long ago, after his father was declared a missing person and would not be coming back, his mother had remarried and was pregnant again. Leo listened blankly, as if he were listening to a radio story that had nothing to do with him. Now, thinking back on his life in Bridgeport, Leo felt that everyone was like a bone chewed and spat out on the ground by life, with only a little bit of meat clinging to it. He had been used to being beaten by his father since he was a child and was particularly good at finding a corner to hide in, doing his own thing without being in the way. He had originally thought he would spend his whole life like that, in some corner of his home. From what his uncle said, it seemed his parents had looked for him for a while after he ran away. But then it just fizzled out. That week, when Julian came to see Leo, Leo calmly recounted the matter on paper. After he finished writing, he paused with the pen in his hand, then wrote another sentence on the paper. "Brother, I've been thinking, I guess I don't have a family anymore." Leo's uncle didn't stay in the city for long. He left after failing to find a good job. Leo continued to go to work on time every day, diligently completing his tasks. In mid-April, Julian said their friend Michael was having a housewarming party and invited them for drinks. They took the train back for the weekend, first stopping by Joe's tailor shop. Joe said he had made a suit for each of them and wanted to see if they fit. Leo and Julian went into the fitting room, came out wearing the suits, and got straight into Joe's van. Leo, a bit confused, asked Julian on a piece of paper if they needed to wear suits to a housewarming party. Julian nodded and said that people in their city were just that particular. But the van drove slowly over the overpass, past the college, and stopped in front of Crestview Apartments. In the spring of 2000, Nearly 3 years had passed since Leo and Julian's fake wedding. In the first spring of the new millennium, Joe had personally tailored 2 new suits. Julian's brother David had laid a set of auspicious dragon and phoenix bedding on the bed in the Crestview bedroom. Michael had prepared red-dyed eggs and sweet glutinous rice soup. Julian once again pulled Leo up the stairs of Crestview and opened the door. Because the preparations were rushed, the double happiness character newly pasted on the window was crooked. Amidst Leo's utter confusion, a wedding even more absurd than the first fake one began. Joe thought this might be the only same-sex wedding he would ever attend in his life, and the only time he would personally make 2 groom suits. One black suit was trimmed with gold, the other with red. One large and one small, worn by Julian and Leo. There were only 3 guests at the wedding. Julian took a ring for Leo from a velvet jewelry box. He slipped it onto Leo's finger and said this was a wedding ceremony. This was his vow to him. After this ceremony, it meant they were a family. He was his family. In this world, he had him as family. Leo was stunned for a long time, then started to cry. Julian asked him if he was willing to please nod. Leo, his face covered in tears, remembered the first time he had an impression of Julian. It was at Joe's event planning company. At the time, he had just finished dancing and, covered in sweat, had rushed into the hall to find his water bottle. Through the dim hall, he saw Joe and another person leaning against the doorway, smoking. Joe, with a cigarette between his fingers, turned his head and waved at him, telling him to come over. Leo, chugging water, looked up. The person next to Joe also turned to look at him. Leo remembered Julian had squinted his eyes at him then, looking at him as if he were a painting hanging in the hall, his expression polite and distant. Now, Julian was holding his hand, looking at him gently, whispering a reminder that if he didn't nod soon, it would be very awkward for him. Leo, through his tears, broke into a smile and nodded. After the guests, such as they were, had left, Julian, with some disdain, poured the bowls of sweet rice soup down the kitchen sink. Leo was resting on the dragon and phoenix bedding. Julian lay down beside him, took one of Leo's hands, and said congratulations on getting married again. Leo stared at him. Julian nodded and teased him that he could kiss the groom now. Leo leaned over and kissed Julian. He spread his arms and held Julian tightly. Julian laughed, saying he was going to squeeze his guts out. "Fine," he said, and hugged Leo back, kissing the crown of his head, saying he loved him too. On the first morning of their new marriage, the 2 grooms had to climb out of the dragon and phoenix bedding to catch an early train back to their respective cities for work. Leo clung to Julian by the front door, kissing him. He would peck Julian's lips, then peck again. Julian asked if he had eaten enough, calling him a little woodpecker. Leo buried his face in his chest and shook his head. They rushed to the train station. Leo's train was the first to leave. He went through the gate to the platform. Julian waved at him from the main hall. They looked at each other through the window glass. In the summer of 2000, after finishing the semester, Julian resigned from his job and found a new teaching position in the city where Leo lived. They moved into a new apartment complex by the river and began their real newlywed life in the sunlight. To get to work, Leo only needed to take the number 2 bus from the stop outside their complex for 4 stops. Julian's commute to the experimental elementary school was a bit farther. He had to transfer once. Around that time, Leo started taking computer classes at night school, 3 times a week, using 2 index fingers to peck at the keyboard. The way I know their story is from hearing people talk about a popular thread on an obscure gay forum in the early 2000s. The original poster's ID was Chili Pepper 831. His first post said he had just learned how to use the internet not long ago, and that he and his partner had stumbled upon this forum by accident. His partner taught him how to try posting to practice his typing. In the thread, Chili Pepper told his own story and the story of his relationship with his partner. The thread started in late 2000 and continued intermittently until early 2002. Chili Pepper typed very slowly, and his updates had no regular pattern. He said he was born in a small fishing village on the Yangtze River and ran away from home at 17 to the city. He had seriously thought about what would have happened if he hadn't run away. He might still be in the fishing village, fishing and mending nets, married to a decent woman introduced by someone, with a brood of kids, fixing the constantly breaking light bulb in a brick house that always smelled of fish. He didn't think there was anything wrong or bad about that life, but he had accidentally bought a train ticket and got on another track in life. On this track, he met an unexpected person. Now they lived together. The rented apartment was not big, the living room was narrow, but if you pushed open the window, you could see the river. He had unexpectedly lost his ability to speak a year ago and was still trying to recover. Recently, he had started going to the hospital for follow-up visits again. The doctor said there was a possibility the injury could heal. Someone replied to the thread asking how they communicated. Chili Pepper replied that he wrote on paper, but he still didn't know many words, and his handwriting was slow and ugly. His partner needed a lot of patience to have a conversation with him, because colleagues or strangers would get impatient with him. He later realized that the process of that person waiting by his side for him to write down every word was a form of understanding and love. Leo finished typing his reply and pressed send. Julian was leaning against the doorframe of the den, knocking on the door, and grumbling that he bought him a used computer for his birthday, and now all he thought about when he came home was it. Leo clumsily moved the mouse, exited the web page, and shut down the computer. He stood up and gestured that he was finishing homework from his teacher. Julian said he had been learning for almost half a year and still only used 2 index fingers to type, that he was afraid those 2 fingers would get injured from overuse. Leo grabbed his whistle and blew it at him. Julian was already immune to the sound of the whistle. After teasing Leo, he went to the dining table to eat dinner on his own. Leo followed him indignantly, picked up his chopsticks, and speared a piece of braised fish. During that time, Mr. Henderson wanted to close his factory and transition to another industry. Because he was short on funds, he wanted to sell the Crestview apartment. Julian and Leo pooled their money and bought it from him. Julian placed the deed on the dining table for Leo to see. They held their rice bowls and looked at the property deed with the Crestview address on it. After buying the apartment, they were in significant debt. Julian joked with Leo, asking what they would do, that they might have to eat cornmeal mush for a while. Leo waved his hand, meaning it was okay, that hardship was what he was best at eating. Of course, they didn't eat cornmeal mush every day. Julian got off work earlier than Leo. After getting off the bus, he would go to the nearby market to buy groceries every day. Julian found that he might really be getting older. He would stand in front of a vegetable stall and haggle with an old lady for half an hour just to get a piece of winter melon for 10 cents cheaper. The old lady was so worn down by him, she was close to just giving him the winter melon. Julian would carry a few red plastic bags and then stop in front of the cooked food stall, pondering whether to buy a roast duck to take home. The roast ducks, golden brown, turned slowly in the rotisserie oven. Leo was busy preparing for the year-end New Year's Eve gala again. So busy every day that he felt he could fall asleep after just a few bites of dinner. In the end, Julian bought half a roast duck and brought it home, placing it on the dining table. In his post that day, Chili Pepper wrote that he had to be in 3 performances recently as a backup dancer. After finishing rehearsals for one dance, he had to start rehearsing another. A friend of his who had gone to Europe to work had been deported and came back with a boyfriend. They came over for dinner. Cassie took a piece of roast duck from the dining table and stood in front of Julian and Leo's bedroom door, asking suspiciously if they only had one bedroom and slept in one bed. Julian asked her if that wasn't allowed. Cassie tilted her head, thinking, and said it wasn't allowed. She then went to look at the photo wall in the living room, at the pictures Julian had taken of Leo. Cassie touched this and that. Leo followed behind her, blowing his whistle. He was very protective of the home he and Julian had decorated together. Every piece of furniture in the living room they had found together. The original sofa had been replaced, but Leo had covered it with a large blanket and piled on a bunch of colorful pillows. When they had nothing to do, He and Julian would curl up on the sofa and watch TV together. They had brought the small, multicolored glass lamp from Crestview and still kept it on the small table next to the sofa, letting it slowly turn. At the dining table, Cassie talked animatedly about her experiences in Europe. Later, Julian held up a hand to stop her, saying Leo was tired and had to rehearse again tomorrow. Cassie said okay. Julian and Leo walked her to the door. Cassie stood at the door, watching the two of them with their arms around each other, waving goodbye to her. Cassie tilted her head again, thinking that something was strange. Chili Pepper 831 replied to a post, apologizing for his slow typing, but saying he was much faster now than before. He said you probably couldn't see him on TV. There were too many backup dancers behind the singers. He said he would stop writing for now, that if he spent too much time on the computer, he would get nagged. Leo turned off the computer, stood up, and stretched. After stretching, it was his habit to do a backbend. Julian had just come out of the bathroom, drying his hair. He picked up a glass of juice from the dining table and took a sip. When Julian got into bed, he felt a box under the covers. Leo had stuck a small note on it, "Happy birthday." Julian opened the box and saw a silver Nokia 3310 inside. Julian rushed to the den and pulled Leo, who was doing a backbend, up, asking if he was crazy. Why he would buy something so expensive? Who was he going to call? Leo thought about it and realized it was true. At the time, he just thought since Julian had given him a computer, he had to save up to give him an expensive phone. A colleague had recommended he buy it. After buying it, he didn't even know how to use it. That day, they sat side by side on the bed, holding the phone box. Julian said they should return it. Leo made a sound of protest. Julian turned to look at him and said to make that sound again. Leo tried to open his mouth and made the sound again. Chili Pepper 831 later wrote in his thread that he was starting to be able to make some sounds like a baby babbling when it first tries to speak. He returned the birthday present he bought for his partner. They took the money and went to a nice restaurant for a good meal. In early 2001, he started to be able to say words one by one. As if he were learning about the world for the first time, he would point at the window and say window, point at a tree and say tree, point at snow and say snow. Julian pointed at himself and teased Leo, asking what he should call him. Leo pointed at him and struggled to say Juju Julian. Julian said, "Idiot, call me husband." After saying it himself, Julian's face flushed red. Leo's face immediately turned red too. They both turned back to watch TV. Later, while watching TV, Leo tried to say who husband. Julian felt a jolt go through his entire body. He held Leo's face and said to forget it, not to call him that. If he said it again, he would have to go and buy the TV station building for him. Chili Pepper 831 asked in the thread what the red light at the top of the page meant, not the red light on the side of the web page that was always blinking. Someone told him it meant someone had replied to his post, and he could just click on the red light to see the replies. Chili Pepper politely replied thank you and then added a smiley face. He had even learned some internet slang now. He told Julian that many people, supposedly from overseas, were also reading his posts, although he only remembered to update it occasionally like a journal. In his thread, he wrote that they went back to Crestview before the Spring Festival to clean the house. They found that someone had splattered pig's blood on their door, and there were childish, crooked words saying they had a disease, that their kind of people were contagious. Leo and Julian stared at the colorful words on the door for a long time. Julian tried to scrub the stains off the door for a long time but couldn't completely remove them. The next time they went, they bought a can of paint and painted the door a beautiful sky blue. When the neighbors went up and down the stairs, that sky blue door was particularly eye-catching. Around New Year's Eve, that door would open and close a few times. Julian would stand at the door and shout down to Leo on the floor below, saying he saw him sneaking a bite of the beef jerky from the bag, asking if he couldn't wait until he was inside to eat. Leo, chewing on the jerky, managed to force out one word: no. Julian helplessly opened the door and waited for him. Ever since he had been able to speak a little, Leo found the act of speaking strangely novel. He would come in and say hello to the sofa, say hi to the TV. Julian listened to him get to know the whole world, stumbling over his words. Joe came to see them and asked if he could join them for New Year's Eve. Not long after Claire passed away, people started asking him if he was going to remarry. Joe buried himself in his tailor shop every day, drawing lines on fabric with chalk, cutting, and sewing. Touching a piece of indigo fabric, he would still think of Claire for no reason. The girl he had loved since he was a child. The first time Claire rejected his confession, Joe had dragged Julian and Michael to a hill and said he was going to jump off and die for love. Julian and Michael sat on the hill and waited for him for half a day. Joe came back down, dejected, and clenched his fist, saying he would just confess again. Joe's mother told him that a new person wouldn't necessarily be bad, that he had to get married and start a family eventually. Joe said he already had a family, that his wife was Claire. When Joe entered Crestview, he patted Julian and said they were now the negative examples in the eyes of all the mothers in the city. Chili Pepper later updated his post after returning home after the new year, telling everyone that he had a happy New Year's celebration at home this year. Their friends spent New Year's Eve with them. They drank a lot of alcohol. Because he couldn't drink, he drank a lot of soda. After getting drunk, Joe passed out on the sofa and refused to get up. Julian, drunk, climbed up from the floor, went into the bathroom, and splashed his face with water. Outside the window, firecrackers were already going off to welcome the new year and scare away the New Year beast. Leo was still there, listening to Unforgettable Tonight. Julian waved at him and said to come and help him up. Leo went over. Julian closed the bathroom door. He held Leo and swayed back and forth, asking if this was his little rice cake. Leo found that Julian became very different when he was truly drunk. He licked Leo's cheek and said he couldn't tell what kind of filling the rice cake had. Leo seriously answered that it had no filling, meaning that rice cakes don't have fillings. Julian insisted that rice cakes do have fillings, that Leo must be red bean paste filling. He wanted to take off Leo's clothes to see if there was filling. Leo was very tickled by him. The two of them pushed and shoved and almost fell into the bathtub. Julian held Leo, their lips kissing. Julian bit Leo's lower lip and rested his forehead against his, whispering that they weren't sick. Did he know that? Leo looked at him and said he knew. That year, they waited until after the anniversary of Claire's death before leaving. Leo bought a bunch of local specialties to give to his colleagues there. When he went back to work after the holidays, he would haltingly greet everyone, offering them this and that. One day when he came home, Julian was wearing an apron and stewing a large pot of pork bones in the kitchen. Leo held a piece of paper full of words for him to see. He had written that a colleague had asked him if he and Julian were really cousins. Julian turned around, holding a ladle, and asked how he had answered them, if they hadn't said anything else. Leo shook his head. Although communication was not yet very developed, and information could not travel quickly from one place to another, the rumors about them finally reached the city where they lived. Chili Pepper 831 hadn't posted online for a while. He later updated his thread, asking if you would deny it if you were asked that kind of question. He said his partner told him to just deny it. He thought that it was lucky he still couldn't speak well, so he could just pretend he couldn't speak clearly. He wondered if this really was a sickness. Would he stop loving him when he recovered? The next day, Leo wrote the same question on a piece of paper and asked the director of a social documentary program. Their TV station had a very famous social documentary program. The director approached Leo and asked if the recent rumors about him were true. At that time, Leo had just come down from a taping, panting and covered in sweat. He just stared blankly and sat there without nodding or shaking his head. That day, the director told Leo that there might be 5 to 10 million gay men like them. If this was a sickness, the scale of this sickness was very large. If it wasn't a sickness, someone had to be willing to say they were healthy. They sat at opposite ends of the break room, and neither of them really had a clear answer. The director wanted to do an episode that truthfully documented what the lives of this group of millions were like. Leo waved his hand and wrote on the paper that he was going to go change. He ran downstairs. That day, Julian got off work early and waited for him at the bottom of the TV station building. They went to their usual small restaurant for dinner. Julian had intermittent bursts of enthusiasm for cooking. One day he would be patiently stewing pork bones, and the next he would throw down his apron and say he would never cook again. That he was covered in grease after cooking and it was hard to wash off. Leo would roll up his sleeves and say he could cook instead. Leo had only cooked once. He turned the gas stove to high and then cooked every dish on high heat. He even asked Julian with confusion why his cooking always burned. Julian tapped his head and asked him what he thought. Why did he think so? When neither of them wanted to cook, they would go to a cheap and good restaurant for a simple meal. Leo looked at their reflection in the restaurant's wall mirror. Julian had turned 30 this year. People often asked him why he wasn't married yet. That time, Julian picked up a piece of sweet and sour potato shreds with his chopsticks and smiled at Leo, saying he had started by saying he was divorced, then later said he was a widower. He had made up all sorts of stories. They sat in the crowded small hall, the floor tiles slippery, steam rising from every table. Leo felt that was the human smoke from the words he had learned. After dinner, because he had gotten his February salary, Leo insisted on buying Julian a DQ Blizzard. They were both so cold their teeth chattered, but because it was so expensive, they forced themselves to finish it. Leo got a stomachache as soon as he got home. Julian rolled a flesh-colored hot water bottle on his stomach and watched the weather forecast with him. Outside, a light frost was starting to fall. The weather forecast said there might be light rain the next day. Leo's hands were a little cold, so he put them inside Julian's sweater to warm up. They always washed up and went to bed after the news broadcast, chatting at night. At 6:30 in the morning, Julian's alarm would go off. Leo would get up with him. They would stand side by side in front of the bathroom mirror, shaving, washing their faces, and brushing their teeth, then run downstairs to catch the bus. The world was misty, and light snow was falling. In the southern city, the snow melted as soon as it hit the ground. Leo tilted his head up, and a snowflake landed on his eyelid. Julian was next to him, asking what he wanted for dinner. His intermittent burst of enthusiasm had passed again. The snowflakes fell one after another. Leo thought, why couldn't their life be considered both beautiful and healthy? In March of 2001, a conflict broke out in Fengshan Park on the east side of the city. About 20 people were taken to the police station. Among them was a 53-year-old man. Leo later saw his face in the news. He was a bit chubby, a bit dazed. People who knew him called him Afu. Afu ran a noodle shop and lived with his 80-year-old mother. They said he was simple-minded, and his business was honest. The handmade noodles he pulled tasted really good. Leo wasn't sure if he and Julian had ever been to Afu's noodle shop and had a meal there. Afu was just that ordinary, that careful small-town citizen. Not long after he was released from the police station, Afu committed suicide by lying on the railroad tracks. The news only said that much. In the news, Afu's name was given as Mr. Lu. The truth behind the news was that Fengshan Park had been discovered to be a gay cruising spot for some time. People often advised others not to go there, that they might get infected with a disease. On that night in March, someone set a fire in Fengshan Park to burn out the virus inside. The fire drove out a dozen or so people. Afu was one of them. The matter quickly spread. No one dared to go to Afu's noodle shop to eat anymore. Afu continued to cut and pull noodles in the back kitchen of the noodle shop as usual, arranging the piles of handmade noodles, waiting for customers. His hands were covered in flour, sweat dripped from his temples. When he stopped to rest, he would stare at the hardware store across the street. Afu was 53 years old. He had a secret, but now that everyone knew, it wasn't a secret anymore. One evening, no one came to the noodle shop at dinner time. After cleaning up the back kitchen, Afu pulled down the shop's rolling shutter and went to the train station. What Leo saw was the scene at the train station. A train was stopped on the tracks. Passengers in the cars were cursing. Mr. Liu's body was quickly removed from the tracks. So the train continued on its way. But when Leo passed Ah Fu's noodle shop, the noodle shop never opened again. It's not clear if it was because of this news or something else. Leo later agreed to participate in the recording of the social documentary, but the person who ultimately sat in front of the camera was Julian. Julian said Leo's mouth still couldn't form complete sentences, so how could he be on an interview show? He said his experiences were, in any case, more complete and had more to say than Leo's. The program was recorded in March and, after production and review, was not broadcast until more than half a year later. On the day the program was broadcast in early October, Julian had something to do at school and wasn't home. Leo sat on the sofa alone, hugging a pillow. The program had censored the real names and locations. Julian's face was also heavily pixelated. He sat in front of the camera, wearing his usual shirt and jacket, with a habit of squinting slightly when he looked at people. Julian told the director frankly that he didn't really want to be on this show, nor did he think it would feel good to talk about his life in front of a camera. He just felt that rather than letting Leo mindlessly sacrifice himself for this kind of thing again, it was better for him to do it. Julian shrugged helplessly. He looked up at the camera with its red light on, swallowed nervously and awkwardly. He introduced himself, saying he was someone who had been regarded as a child prodigy from a young age because he really could remember things after seeing them once. At first, everyone praised him. Then gradually they started saying behind his back that he became more and more ordinary as he grew up. He did indeed become more and more ordinary and ultimately didn't achieve anything great. He discovered he might prefer boys when he was in junior high. That year, the local newspaper interviewed and reported on him. He had sat, just like now, upright in front of the interviewer, talking about his life with a sense of shame. Now, looking back, Julian always felt that at 15, he might have already known he was destined to be a failure. This year, he turned 30. He squeezed onto the bus to and from work every day, went to the mall to buy out-of-season goods to take home. But now, he didn't feel any shame. Julian said he and his partner really liked to wait for the nearly expired bread. Felt like they had won something when they bought it. One day, he discovered they could go to the bread factory to buy the imperfect but still edible scraps. Then they bought a pile of red bean buns with the filling spilling out or pieces of cake like crumbled sponge. They were delicious too. When the weather was cool and the bread didn't spoil easily, it could be breakfast for many days. Julian rubbed his hands together and continued, saying anyway, he hadn't wanted to be a genius when he was born, and later he hadn't thought he would become gay. He had nothing to say. It's good to admit to being a genius, but not good to admit to being gay. Actually, both are hard to be, but they are both me. At 18, Julian failed his college entrance exams. His scores were just enough to get into the electrical engineering department of the community college. The talk of him being a genius slowly faded away. He lived in a dorm with 3 other guys. After playing basketball, they would all strip down and rush into the shower. In the summer, they would just wear shorts and walk around the dorm. Julian would lean on the hallway railing with them, whistling at the girls coming out of the shower below, or help a roommate deliver a love letter. He tried very hard to pretend to be normal. Later, when it was said he was gay, he heard that some of his former roommates were scared and disgusted. Julian said that during those 4 years, the person who felt the most scared and disgusted was definitely himself. He had to endure great disgust to put on that act, just hoping not to disgust others. He stared blankly at the director sitting in front of him and suddenly started talking about a year when he took Leo to see a traditional Chinese medicine doctor. The doctor lived in the remote mountains. They traveled over mountains and rivers to get there. The clinic was a dilapidated wooden house. The hall was dim. In the light coming through the window, you could see fluffy, tiny dust particles. Julian looked at the large glass jars on the clinic's counter, filled with an amber-colored liquid. Inside each jar was a congealed, dark mass. He asked the doctor what was inside. The old doctor, his eyes looking as if he couldn't see, whispered, "Mimi." Julian thought he hadn't heard clearly and asked again. The old doctor's voice repeated in the silent hall, "Mimi." Now, thinking back, Julian felt it might have been some kind of local dialect. He didn't know what the word was, but at the time, he stared at those huge amber glass jars and felt they were a kind of metaphor for his past life. A stagnant, unflowing mass trapped in a glass jar, an object he couldn't escape from. Actually, he had thought that if Leo hadn't appeared at 53, he would have been Afu. Julian said it was indeed after meeting him that he discovered his arms could be used to hug someone. At the end of June 1997, the weather was scorching hot. The black sedan that came to pick up the bride swayed to a stop in front of the event planning company. The people inside were still frantically helping the bride put on her earrings and lipstick. Julian got out of the back seat, looked at his watch, and then looked up at the shops across the street. Claire shouted from inside that the ride was here. Julian turned around. His bride, holding up her long wedding dress, walked out unsteadily in her silver high heels. Julian held a bouquet of red roses and baby's breath. He handed the bouquet over. As the bride was about to take it, she stumbled and almost fell. Julian caught him and simply picked him up, carrying him into the back seat of the car. The children on the street cheered and knocked on the car window, asking for wedding candy. The car started slowly. The bride, holding the bouquet, smiled foolishly at Julian. That was already in 1997. In 98, there was a major flood. In 98, he was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. In 98, the whole city was talking about him. He was later said to have been cured and discharged from the hospital, but the treatment left him with a severe drug dependency. Even now, he was still secretly taking painkillers to combat the side effects, hiding it from Leo. Julian asked what kind of beautiful life they wanted to hear about. He said they didn't have a beautiful life. Recently, the two of them were saving money to buy a new refrigerator before summer. His partner had finished his computer classes and planned to learn English. He might be promoted to teach at a middle school. That's it. He said he really didn't want to be on this show, but since he was sitting here and had talked for so long, he hoped that people like them who saw it would know that they were not alone. That day, after Julian finished his work at school and went home, Leo flew over and hugged him as soon as he walked in the door. Julian had just moved offices and was covered in sweat. He pushed Leo away helplessly, telling him to let him take a shower first, asking if he was having an episode, what flavor of hug this was. Leo held onto Julian, his face pressed against him, refusing to let go. Julian, with one shoe off and one on, just stood there and let him hug him. He looked at their living room, rested his chin on the top of Leo's head, and whispered that he was dead tired. Later, in one of his last updates, Chili Pepper 831 said that when he escaped from Bridgeport in 1997, he had originally bought a ticket for another train. But because he was scared of being alone, he followed a fellow villager onto the train he ended up taking. He had thought about what would have happened to his and Julian's lives if he had taken the other train according to his original plan. Maybe years later, he would be a street dancer in some city and pass through Julian's city. As he was dancing on the street, Julian would ride his bike past his spot. Their lives would have intersected for only those few seconds. In fact, an encounter is truly equivalent to a miracle. Chili Pepper 831's account stopped updating in early 2002. Maybe, as Julian said, he had enthusiastically gone to learn English. I used to think that the story in that account might be fictional. But one day, I found a newspaper clipping from December 1999 in the city library's archives. The report on Leo's heroic act, because it was right next to the report on the Macau Handover Celebration performance troupe, had been preserved. The report was short and had no picture. His face was unknown. The social documentary interview with Julian was also preserved on a videotape at the TV station. I pieced together the story of these two people through these clues. My intention is not to create a legend for anyone. In the end, they are just two extremely small, ordinary people. I even suspect that on the day the city's subway line 1 opened, they might have been in the same crowd as me. But even if we were in the same subway car, I wouldn't have known it was them. They went to and from work as usual every day, waited at the street corner for nearly expired bread, and haggled with the old lady at the market. They might be carrying a large bag of groceries, chewing on a soda straw, waiting at the same red light as you and me. September 11th, 2001. 2002, the first SARS case in the world. 2003, Leslie Chung's death. The world changes. I don't know if they are still together today, or even if they are still alive. The last trace I found of them was in the CRS of a TV station program from a few years ago. The dance director was named Leo. I think maybe it was him, maybe not. I also saw the name Julian on the list of outstanding teachers in the district. Maybe it was him, maybe not. The era turns. This is just a record of a deep, long embrace that happened at the turn of the century.